Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Thursday, February 13th, and today I'm doing a video explaining the difference between accidental and essential dignity. Now, this question came up from a couple of viewers after recently doing a video on the topic of essential dignities, and someone said, I've heard the word or phrase accidental dignity thrown around a bunch and don't really understand the difference between an accidental dignity and an essential dignity. Along with this comes the topic of planetary joys and the difference between a planetary joy and a planetary dignity like domicile or exaltation rulership. So I'm going to talk about both of those topics today. I'll talk about joys, the difference between joys and essential dignity, essential forms of essential dignity at the beginning really briefly. And then I'm going to show you a chart from a recent client who gave me permission to share, showing you how I used a combination of essential and accidental dignity to make a prediction that turned out to be true within the course of a reading. So let's go ahead and let's start with this idea of what's the difference between an essential, an essential dignity and a planetary joy. So in ancient astrology, in Hellenistic astrology, when a planet is in its home sign, as I said in the video I did recently on essential dignities, which you could go and check back on if you want to get the kind of full background of what I'm about to say, a planet that is in its home sign or its own exaltation will be more able to act and behave like its best self. A planet in its own sign is like you or me, you know, in our own bedroom, in our own house on a Saturday with nothing to do. It's like we can kind of do whatever we want, and we're in the environment that's most suited to us in our kind of essence. So Venus in Libra, you get more, you know, kind of pure, straight, strong Venusian energy. When you place a planet in any other sign, its dignity is then compromised by, or qualified might be a better way of putting it, by the planet in whose sign or temple it is in. So when Venus is in Leo, is a recent example that I gave, it will be given things to suit its needs and desires and wishes by the sun, who is the host of the sign of Leo. So then what you're doing is you're trying to understand Venus expressing through a solar lens, or what you're trying to say is that Venus will do something and the sun will give it the raw material. Like I'm in the house of the sun and I'm Venus, I want beauty. The sun sits down before me a plate of gold because the sun rules gold, for example. So this is part of how we end up blending essential dignities. And then we said that there are placements traditionally where a planet will be in a sign opposite to its own, or in the sign opposite to its exaltation, where it will be in its depression or its exile, sometimes called detriment or fall. Those placements are positions where often whatever the planet needs to do according to its own nature will be more compromised. That's the word compromise is actually appropriate, because the host is going to give things that are in some ways contrary to the nature of the planet. For example, when you put Mars in Cancer, Mars wants to cut and fight, and the moon's like, here's an animal, here's a mother, here's something sweet and domestic, just as an example. But there can be other examples too, we said, that aren't always negative. For example, Mars wants to, you know, compete, and, you know, Cancer, the moon sign says, let me give you water, so you're an incredible swimmer or something like that. But you're always looking, generally speaking, at the dignities as a way of saying, when this planet's in its home sign or its own exaltation, it's like, oh, just kind of does its thing, and it's really easy, natural for it to do its thing. When it's in a sign that is contrary to its own nature, or that is getting provided something by another planet that might be a little bit difficult, that's why we have a category of saying fall or exile and so forth. But always you have to look at the position of the host. So even if Mars was in Cancer, where is the moon? You know, where is, if the moon is in Capricorn or in Libra or some other sign, the aspectual relationship and the nature of what the moon is up to will also specify what the moon in particular in the chart has to give. So the first level of a dignity is always exploring just the basic position of planet in some other planet's house or sign if it's not in its own. And generally, what does that planet give? So again, if Mars is in, you know, Virgo, then what does Mercury give to Mars? That's the first layer. Then specifically, where is Mercury in the chart? What is Mercury's dignity and house position? And how does Mercury then feed Mars? Whatever, is a house guest. What am I going to feed you? Says Mercury, based on the fact that, I'm in Leo and I'm in the 12th house or something else. So astrologers are always learning. In the beginning of a practice, you're learning really to just connect those basic level of planetary combinations and just understand what kind of expression a planet is going to have. And that's its essential dignity. That's essentially the blend that the planet is going to present. The next level of examination is where we look at accidental dignity. And accidental dignity has to do, for example, with saying, okay, Mars is in Virgo, Mercury is going to feed Mars something, but where is Mercury? Mercury's context and situation in the chart, its own dignity even, would be like a secondary level of analysis. And a lot of that analysis is going to fall into another broad category that we call accidental dignity. Now, accidental dignity will mean, for example, that a planet that's in the 12th, 8th, or 6th houses traditionally had fallen in a place that was more difficult and challenging. And there's very beautiful astronomical symbolism behind why each house is considered to be related to the topics that it's related to, as well as, generally speaking, why a house may be more beneficial, favorable, easy, or difficult. And it is not actually primarily not connected to the ordering of the signs. In other words, we don't get the meanings of the 12th house from the sign of Pisces. So anyway, so the study of accidental dignity, I'm going to show you an example in a minute, is going to focus on not just the planet by virtue of what combination you're making between one planet and another, vis-a-vis the sign position. So again, on this level, it's Mercury, or let's say Mars is in Virgo, and Mars is therefore reliant upon Mercury. So I'm blending that combination a little bit. But then the accidental dignity comes in. And accidental dignity would be the factor. I'll give you a few simple factors of accidental dignity. The house position. That tells us the environment in which the combination that we're blending up between Mars and Mercury when Mars is in Virgo is taking place in. And then from there, we could also look at aspects. So Mars is in Virgo. Now it's in the 12th house. So we've blended Mars and Mercury. And then we placed that blend within the 12th house and said, what does that blend look like when it's in this environment? So the accidental dignity is always the context or the environment in which the planetary archetypal combination finds itself and expresses itself. Accidental dignity will also be taking into consideration the other house topics that a planet might rule. For example, the houses of Aries and Scorpio are going to be ruled by Mars, and hence Mars has representative power over those topics in the birth chart. And then we're also analyzing the context of Mars in whatever house it's in as the ruler of the house of Scorpio and Aries. So you start getting like a real complicated tapestry that's being woven. This is why people, when they really study astrology, they start going like, oh my God, this is really complicated. I don't know if I can do this. Well, welcome to real astrology, in my opinion, because it's not like, where it's not a color by number situation here. We have it turns out that it's quite an art form to learn how to combine many different elements at once and to do so intuitively over time. So at any rate, sorry, I don't mean to, that was not altogether nice. So, but at any rate, it is true. And the thing about assessing accidental dignity is that it's the second and very next important layer of interpretation, where you're going, okay, what's the house position of Mars in Virgo? What aspects are being made by other planets, by whole sign house aspects and by degree-based aspects? Ancient astrologers considered two types of aspects. So you're looking at everything that's aspecting that planet that you're analyzing. You're looking at potential receptions between planets that are aspecting the planet that you're analyzing. For example, like I said earlier, when Mars is in Virgo, you analyze the house position to get the context, and then you need to know, where is Mercury in relation to Mars in Virgo? And do they have aspectual connection or not? Or are they not seeing each other by aspect? That's important. If they are seeing each other, then are they seeing one another from, you know, some beneficial placement? For example, Mercury is in Scorpio, which is Mars's sign, and Mars is in Virgo, which is Mercury's sign. So they're in each other's signs. They have mutual reception with each other. So there's all sorts of factors and elements that go into breaking down the context within which the initial analysis of dignity is taking place. Dignity is just giving you like the base ingredients to mix up. Accidental is then telling you which environment, which circumstances to put it in. And typically that's going to be by house position and by aspects being made to that planet that you're analyzing. Okay, so that's a brief definition of the difference between accidental and essential dignity. It's in the course that I teach, you know, I think there's probably like 6 to 8 hours worth of material teaching people how to notice and analyze the main factors of accidental dignity. You really have to know your houses very, very well. And you have to not know just a list of topics, but why those topics were ever established in the way that they were. You have to know the underlying rationale between those topics, or you're bankrupt when it comes to doing really good astrology. This is why it's also important to not just sit back and go, oh yeah, the 6th house has to do with Virgo, the 7th with Libra, the 8th with Scorpio, because that's not the actual rationale behind the topics of the houses. So you have to get to know the deeper, you know, kind of classical backbone of the houses in order to then have a much deeper skeleton key with which to understand the context that a planet is in. So accidental dignity is a whole sort of science of the houses that most people really don't know much about. They've just inherited either a list of things that they associate with each house. They have no idea why, or they think that the reason that the topics are associated with the house has to do with the sign that they associate in alphabetical sort of numerical order, the 12-letter alphabet we call this. Why are siblings related to the 3rd house, Gemini? Well, that's not the original rationale. And so then we have to say, well, you know, like, for example, when a person, you'll always notice if you say to a person, well, why is Gemini related to siblings? And they'll say the 3rd house. And they say, why is the 3rd house related to siblings? And they'll say Gemini. You know, this is not good reasoning. And we need a deeper underlying rationale as to why this section of the sky, which is what we now call a house, traditionally topoi or place, was ever associated with the topics that it was associated with. And it turns out it's different than the signs. So you have to understand the context within which a planet is appearing, the 12 houses. I think there's 20 hours worth of lectures in my course on the houses, because you have to go really, really deep with the houses to have an understanding of why they all pertain to the topics that they do. And oftentimes people mistake, they'll be like, oh, the 7th house, you know, that's the house of marriage and case closed. Well, there was actually a couple of places and planets that could refer to marriage traditionally. Same thing with money, same thing with sex, same thing with death, you know, same thing with friends and family members, parents, health, you know, disease, sickness, travel. There's houses, lots of different places that can represent topics. It's just that they represent those topics in different ways or for different reasons. So anyway, there's a lot to the study of accidental dignity. That's what I'm trying to illustrate right now. What to speak of aspect theory and you know, understanding reception through aspects, all of which define and make much more specific the picture that begins with the analysis of a planet's dignity. So, and this is something that eventually, once you, at first, you know, you're learning it, it's kind of like, you know, you're dealing with the grammar and syntax of a language you don't know. So of course it feels kind of like, you know, this sucks. But then you learn it over time, and then you start picking it up, and it's like a music, and it becomes very intuitive and artful the way that the language can flow. That takes time, and most of all, it takes repetition of the basics. You know, people in modern astrology, in my humble opinion, I don't mean to sound like a total jerk here, but in my humble opinion, there's a lot of people majoring in minor things, getting PhDs in minor things. And when people don't really understand the basics of things like houses, signs, planets, dignities, etc., well enough, and when you do, it turns out that that's where complexity and sophistication comes from. It's not from learning a million different aspect shapes and a million different asteroids and so forth. in my opinion, until one develops economy of craft, it doesn't matter what kind of astrology you do, it's not going to be very meaningful or very accurate. But that's, that's me preaching. That's one of my rants. I love that one. So at any rate, let's we're going to take a look at a chart. But before I do that, let me explain to you briefly what planetary joys are, because someone else had this question. So when you are trying to understand what a house means, it's also true that there are planetary affiliations with houses that can help you also to understand the meaning of a house. But they are not the same as the 12-letter alphabet again. So sometimes people will associate Aries with the first house with Mars, Taurus with the second house with Venus, like that around the wheel. This is a misconception. The planets associated with the places go like this. Mercury rejoices in the first house. The moon rejoices in the third house. Venus rejoices in the fifth house. Mars rejoices in the sixth house. The sun rejoices in the ninth house. Jupiter rejoices in the 11th house, and Saturn rejoices in the 12th house. So I'm not going to give a whole talk on planetary joys, but the basic meaning of planetary, there's a lot of really interesting esoteric rationale behind the joys that I also can't go into right now, that I do again in my course. Shameless self-promotion. But the main thing to know about the joys is that what it means is that if you really want to know how to think about a house, the context that a planet is in relation to another planetary archetype, learn the joys. The first house is a bit like Mercury, and Mercury is a bit like the first house. And there's very interesting reasons for that. Saturn is like the 12th house. If a planet is in one of the whole sign houses in which it naturally rejoices, that does give the planet, it's as though in light of perhaps not being well dignified, a planet is nonetheless in an environment that is conducive to its own natural character coming out. For example, I may not be in my home, and I may not be anybody that anybody knows, but if I'm on the subway and I find, I'm out on the subway and I find myself sitting on a bench next to a couple of people who are, reading their horoscopes, you know what I mean? That environment is going to be conducive to the essentialness of me coming out and expressing itself a little bit more easily, even though I may not, there's nothing inherently about the subway, let's say the sign, that supports me. And so a simple way of thinking about planetary joys is that if you have if you have Saturn in the 12th, or Jupiter in the 11th, or the sun in the 9th, or Mars in the 6th, Venus in the 5th, moon in the 3rd, or Mercury in the 1st, that those are places where even if the planet isn't well dignified by sign and it has to compromise with some other planet, it will nonetheless be a little bit more like itself and a little bit sort of less qualified by the other planet, depending, of course, on other contextual factors. But because it is in the place of its joy, it's in an environment that's going to support more of its essential nature coming out. And there are beautiful, elaborate reasons for all of this. For example, this summer, I'm giving a talk at the Great Lakes Astrology Conference in Michigan about the joy of Saturn being in the 12th house, and what we can learn about Saturn and what we can learn about the 12th house by virtue of this ancient connection between planet and 12th house. So anyway, the joys are a whole beautiful topic, but they also help us. There's always some interconnective tissue between one area of astrology and another. Anyway, so that's a little bit about accidental dignities and joys. Now I'm going to give you a chart example. So this comes from, with permission from a client. And I want to show you how I made an interpretation in this chart based on the essential and accidental dignity. And I'm also going to throw in something called derived houses. So while looking over the course of a lot of things that happened in this reading, one of the things that I noticed was that it looked like there could be a troubling story around a sibling, possibly a brother or maybe a few brothers. That was my guess. Now, why? We go to the third house of siblings. Oops. You go to the third house of siblings in this chart. And as I'm surveying, I survey lots of stuff in a birth chart reading, but here's the third house of siblings. Now, there's no planet in that environment, but the ruler of that environment can also tell us about the topics of that environment, one of which is siblings. Well, that's Mars, because we have a third house in Scorpio. Here is Mars at the midheaven. Sorry about that. I had someone knocking at my door. Okay, so here's Mars, the ruler of the house of siblings. And it is in the sign of Gemini. and it's in the 10th house. So it's close to the midheaven, which it's close-ish to the point where I'm going, okay, something about brother is very prominent. Now, prominent does not in ancient astrology mean good. It could mean infamous, or it could mean famous. In this chart, we also know that it's a daytime chart, which makes Mars what we call the malefic, contrary to the sect in favor. Mars, as as one of my teachers, John Frawley, sometimes likes to say, Mars is a baddie. So, not necessarily, right? Mars could indicate lots of good things, but Mars can be more of a troublemaker in a daytime chart, Saturn in a nighttime chart. So I'm looking and going, a prominent brother, or brother because of Mars probably being more masculine, but it could be a sister. It could be even close friends with the third house ruler. But I went immediately to the feeling of this being a brother, or possibly brothers, plural. And because of its prominence in the chart and its kind of malefic qualities, I just started scratching my head going, brother's maybe successful, but kind of a scoundrel. Brother is infamous for something. So that's where I started the interpretation. Now, how did I get there? Well, as I just showed you, the context means everything, right? So first of all, I'm just locating Mars as the ruler of the house of siblings by context, accidental dignity. It's a daytime chart, which gives Mars a little bit more maleficence. We know that Mars tends to be overheated and excessively hot and fiery in daytime charts, according to ancient astrologers. Mars is not only, therefore, the malefic contrary to the sect, but is in a very powerful position near a degree of fame. Now, it's a little broad orb, 10 degrees to the midheaven, but I'm looking at that proximity and paying close attention to it here. And then, so the context immediately starts plugging me into what this Mars might be saying about siblings. So that's the pathway that I followed. That's mostly accidental dignity so far, right? I didn't start with essential dignity. I started with accidental. Now I'm going, okay, well, let's get some more information. I want to look and see about the essential dignity. Okay, Mars is not in his own sign. Instead, Mars is in Mercury's sign. And oh, look, Mercury is retrograde under the beams of the sun, conjoined with the south node of the moon. So now I'm taking Mercury's context into consideration, and in the 8th house, which we know is a difficult house. It can pertain to things like death, fear, crime, penalties and debts, all sorts of stuff. Mercury is retrograde under the beams, combust, can't give very good things to Mars. So how is Mercury going to qualify this Mars? Not in a particularly nice way. Now, the south node of the moon, here, if you look at the Vedic or Indian interpretation or the Western interpretation, would probably make this Mercury prone to either otherworldliness, escapism, some form of retreat from the world through things like drugs or alcohol, or some form of spiritual escape, or even trying to escape the law. But the Indian understanding of Ketu with Mercury would typically be, in the 8th house, related to things like crime, thievery, or maybe problems with drugs, stuff like that. There's other possibilities, but those are strong ones. Now, but one thing that's also interesting here is that Mercury is in Aries, which is the sign of Mars. So now we see that they have mutual reception with one another. They're in cahoots with one another. This strengthens the dynamic between them, but again, it doesn't necessarily make it good. It just strengthens it. So we know that this brother probably has some kind of 8th house trouble, that he's done things that are both Mars and Mercury like, that may be difficult or not entirely good, or possibly get him into trouble or something like that. And then we can also see that he may also be very good at Mercury Mars kinds of things, which could mean anything: math, science, chemistry. Could be a good thief. You don't know. But there's a lot of Mars Mercury combinations that person could be, business, sales, communication, learning, could be quite smart. But anyway, so we know brother might have these strong qualities, but they're probably not turning out good results for him. And there's going to be probably some kind of real trouble based on this combination. Now, these combinations, by the way, could be extracted from an analysis of brother and applied to something psychological about the native themselves, because Mercury is their ascendant ruler. So there's always different layers of interpretation that are available to us. At any rate, the next thing that I did was I go, okay, we need to start figuring out what houses the brother, these planets are in relative to the brother's house. So here's how you do derived houses. You can see me sort of doing it around the wheel. I'll put this in here. So hopefully you can see that. I've just numbered the houses around. Sorry, it's a little messy. But what this means is that these planets relative to the brother's house, which is the third house, are going to be, this is called derived houses. And Indian astrologers do this and ancient Hellenistic astrologers do this. You start looking, okay, looks like this Mercury is in the 6th house relative to the brother, and the Mars is in the 8th house relative to the brother. So you also have confirmation by virtue of another accidental technique, a technique that's meant to help us get the context in which the planetary ruler is situated. So now we're saying Mars is actually in the derived 8th house from the brother's house. Brother's is the 3rd house. His 3rd house becomes house 1, and then you count off in order. You get to Mars, you're in the 8th house from the brother's house. And then Mercury is in the 6th house from the brother's house. So all of this only confirmed for me through the 8th house and 6th house that we have probably a brother who's either struggled with health, who's been in debt, who's had some kind of behavioral problems, maybe money problems, maybe he's talented or skilled in some way that's Mercury Mars like, but real problems, and probably the kind that have been visible or have brought some degree of, like maybe besmirched the family name even a little bit with Mars so close to the midheaven up there. Anyway, so that's the thinking that came through for me. And when I look at this at this point in my career, that thinking, that little analysis that I just showed you and combining all of those factors happens for me usually in a matter of, maybe 15 or 20 seconds. It's very quick for me now because of lots and lots and lots of practice. But it basically just comes through like this. I said, just very simply, I said, do you have like a really troubled brother, or a brother who's done something or been through something that's been really difficult? Something like that, right? So it's a general question. I'm not going to, because I'm seeing something doesn't mean that it's the exact interpretation. I could actually paint for you 3 or 4 other possibilities of what the 3rd house ruler being in this position might indicate, and it probably does indicate in the life of the individual. So there's always layers. The oracle is like a multi-dimensional neon, wishing pool filled with all sorts of images. And when you know how to work this language, both the essential and the accidental, you know how to work the combination of planet and sign, planetary relationships, and then house and all these other contexts like sect and aspect and so forth, derived houses. Then you start, an image appears in the neon well, and you just speak it or ask about it or say, I'm seeing this, is that relevant? And a person will then give you feedback. So in this case, unfortunately, the individual's brother had a real drug problem, and I can't remember if there was thievery involved or not, but I believe there was, or something to do with money, drugs, thievery, something illegal, etc., and ended up going to jail. So this was an example in a recent reading. There's, this is like every day in my practice. This is the kind of thing that I see where different elements of the reading will hit. That if you read the context real specifically, combined with the dignities of the planets, then that's when you start getting a picture. A picture is forming. So I'm going to roll through that one more time in case you want to hear it repeated. I started with 3rd house ruler because I wanted to know, hey, how are the topic of siblings in this person's life, if they have them? And I go to Mars, the ruler. I notice Mars is kind of close to the midheaven. I notice it's a daytime chart. I'm taking accidental dignity into consideration. So possibly not a great Mars, but a strong, pronounced, maybe even public Mars. So maybe some degree of infamy for a brother. Brother, why? Because Mars is masculine in an air sign that's masculine. I think maybe multiple brothers with Gemini, but that's where I start. Then I continue to say, well, Mars is in Mercury's sign, and oh, look, Mercury is with the south node, combust, and retrograde in the 8th house. Then I further take into consideration that these planets that are a part of this are in the derived 6th and 8th houses from the brother's house. Further amplifies the feeling for me that there's something either really difficult about brother, some kind of infamy with brother, health problem with brother, some kind of financial or monetary problem with brother, etc. And that's loose. I don't know if that hits or not. It could, like I said, there could be a lot of other meanings. I asked the client, and then the client's like, "Yeah, I have this really kind of horrible story with my brother." Okay, so that is an example of how astrologers use accidental and essential dignities together in order to say things that are predictively specific about a person's karma. Notice that I am not saying that Mercury and Mars, in this case, in this sort of prediction, have anything to do with the native, this chart owner, the client. I'm not saying it has anything to do with their psychology, their personality. I'm not telling them that this happened because they caused it somehow. I'm not psychoanalyzing. I'm not counseling. I am simply a descriptor. I'm simply giving descriptions. I'm a describer. I'm an interpreter of the person's karma, their fate, their destiny. Astrology is, first and foremost, in the history of astrology, a karmic science, meaning that the birth chart is telling us about the karma in the garden of life that's ready to blossom because of previous choices that we've made. All of it can be deeply instructive. All of it can be beautiful. All of it can be meaningful. And we don't know to what degree some of it might even be able to be changed. But nonetheless, we're tasked with the responsibility of describing it as accurately as we can in different areas of life. We do this so that a person can know what the weather's like that's coming, so that they can feel validated in the weather they've experienced in the past, so they can locate some essential sense of self and purpose in the karmic field that they're born into. From there, we might be also trained in counseling a person. We might be trained in helping a person understand some of the deeper psychological wiring that maybe is a part of why some of the karma is the way that it is. But even then, we should also be very, very careful. If you heard the video I just recently did on karma. So then, maybe we can provide, after we've done our kind of karmic analysis, the history of astrology in the last 100 years, 150 years, has developed into a counseling tool. But unless a person understands the diagnostic, karmic, predictive language of astrology, it's my opinion that a lot of the times what ends up happening is many things in the chart that actually pertain to the external circumstances of your fate and karma end up internalizing them, thinking that they're a part of you. And it turns out that, we are really who we are discovering ourselves to be in relation to what the chart is describing. So the counseling part of this is very interesting. And it's an interesting development. It's not the only way to do astrology. But regardless, as you can see, what an amazing tool it is when you end up combining essential dignity about a planet, take that first level of planetary meaning, and then combine it with the context in the chart in which the planets find themselves. And that's how full analysis takes place. Now, if you find any of this interesting, this is shameless self-promotion. Next month in, all right. So next month, I will be opening registration again for my Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic course. It's a one-year course. It meets on Sundays starting in June. I believe it starts June 14th. And you can find out more on my website, nightlightastrology.com. I have need-based tuition. There's an option, kind of like an early bird option. If you pay in full before the start of the program, you get much discounted tuition. Need-based for people who are unemployed or full-time parents and whatever on disability, something like that. Single parents. A lot have helped a lot of people to take the program. I don't like anyone to ever be priced out. So you guys can check that out. The registration opens next month. It starts in June. This is a kind of a cool follow-up talk, mostly to help people understand the difference between accidental dignity and essential dignity. So hopefully this has been fun and interesting. And I hope to be in touch again soon. There's a lot of planetary events coming up later this month that'll be good to dive into together. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.